Winter did not arrive politely in the Northern Rockies. It came early. It came hard. And it stayed. By November, the wind had already stripped the valleys bare. Snow pressed against cabin walls like a living thing, finding every crack, every weakness. Nights stretched long and silent, broken only by the sound of axes splitting firewood and the dull thump of logs fed into hungry hearths. In this land, survival followed an unwritten rule: raise walls fast, or freeze. Logs were stacked. Mud was packed into gaps. Chimneys rose crooked against the sky. Every family knew the routine: cut more wood, burn more wood, pray it would be enough. And then there was one man who did the opposite. Instead of raising walls, he lowered himself into the earth. Instead of stacking logs, he lifted a pickaxe. Instead of fighting the cold, he disappeared into the rock beneath it, along a limestone hillside overlooking the Yellowstone River Valley. Neighbors gathered to watch what they believed was madness. A solitary figure worked in silence, chipping steadily into solid stone as winter closed in around him. They whispered to one another, "He's digging his own grave. Winter will take him first. Stone is cold. Everyone knows that. In a land where speed meant life. This man chose patience. And that choice would change everything. You see, frontier winters punished mistakes without mercy. A poorly sealed cabin meant frostbitten fingers. A dying fire in the night meant children coughing beneath wool blankets, breath fogging the air indoors. Even the best-built log homes bled heat upward and outward, demanding constant fuel in return. Most settlers accepted this as the price of survival. But this man, quiet, methodical, foreign in both accent and thinking, saw something others had missed. While his neighbors saw a useless rocky slope, he saw shelter already waiting. While they feared stone for its cold touch, he trusted it for its memory. Because deep underground, winter loses its power. This was not guesswork. It was observation. It was experience earned far from these valleys. He understood something simple, yet profoundly overlooked. The earth does not care about seasons. Beneath the surface, temperature steadies. Heat moves slowly. Stone absorbs warmth and releases it on its own time, not the wind's. Fire, when used wisely, does not need to roar. It only needs to charge what already exists. But in 1883, on the American frontier, such thinking sounded backward. Primitive. Almost insulting. Progress, after all, was measured in timber raised, not rock removed. So they laughed. They laughed as he carved his entrance downward instead of outward. They laughed as days passed, and no walls rose above ground. They laughed as winter crept closer, and the wind sharpened its edge. What they didn't know, what no one could yet see, was that the cold was already losing. Because while cabins fought winter one log at a time, this man had made a quieter alliance. He had chosen to work with the land, not against it. He had turned the hillside itself into a shield. And when the real cold came, when temperatures plunged below zero, when firewood piles vanished and chimneys never slept, the difference would no longer be theoretical. It would be measurable. In degrees. In hours of warmth. In nights slept without waking to feed the fire. This is not a story about genius in the modern sense. There were no blueprints. No patents. No machines. It is a story about remembering what the earth has always known. About a man willing to look foolish long enough to be right. About a winter that tested every assumption of frontier survival. And about a shelter carved not from desperation, but from understanding. Because sometimes the smartest way to survive winter is not to build higher walls. It is to step quietly into the ground beneath your feet and listen. And that story begins here. To understand why this man's decision mattered, you have to understand the winter he was facing. The Northern Rockies in the late 19th century were not merely cold. They were unforgiving. This was not the kind of winter that arrived, passed, and softened. It settled in early, often by October, and refused to loosen its grip until late April or even May. Snowfall was heavy, but wind was the true enemy. It stripped warmth from bodies and buildings alike, forcing heat to rise, escape, and vanish into the sky. Temperatures regularly dropped below 0 Fahrenheit. Not for hours, 4 days at a time. On the coldest nights, the land itself seemed to crack. Green timber split with sharp reports. Water froze inside barrels. Metal burned bare skin. Livestock collapsed where they stood. And shelter, real shelter, was never guaranteed. Most settlers brought with them a single trusted solution: the log cabin. It made sense. Logs were familiar. They could be cut, stacked, and sealed quickly. A cabin could be raised in weeks, sometimes days, and a fire inside meant immediate relief from the cold. But the Rockies exposed the weakness of that design. Wood, for all its virtues, is a poor keeper of heat. It warms fast and cools just as fast. A typical frontier cabin relied on a single fireplace or small stove. Heat climbed toward the ceiling, leaked through the roof, and escaped through every imperfect joint. To stay warm, fires had to be fed constantly, night after night, hour after hour. For 5, sometimes 6 cords of wood per winter were burned just to keep interior temperatures hovering near tolerable. And even then, warmth was uneven. The space near the hearth might reach 50 degrees. Corners remained cold. Bedrooms were worse. Children slept fully clothed. Water froze beside beds. Breath fogged the air indoors. This was accepted as normal. Frontier wisdom said this was simply the price of living in harsh country. Cut more wood. Build bigger fires. Work harder. But the Rockies were not forests like the eastern states. Timber was unevenly distributed. Valleys held trees, but hillsides and escarpments often did not. Hauling firewood uphill through snow consumed precious energy. And every winter, families learned the same lesson again. Fuel was life, and life was fragile. Yet in all this urgency, few questioned the basic assumption behind frontier building, that shelter must rise above the ground. Cabins were designed to stand apart from the earth, not within it. Stone was used sparingly for foundations, chimneys, or markers, not as living space. Stone was considered cold, damp, and dangerous, a material that stole heat instead of protecting it, and so the settlers avoided it. They saw rocky land as useless, too hard to dig, too steep to farm, too barren to support cattle. Such claims were often rejected outright, left untouched on land office maps. But winter does not care about tradition. It only tests results. The truth, one largely forgotten by industrial-age builders, was that the earth beneath those rocky slopes held something rare and powerful: stability. Just a few dozen feet below the surface, temperatures barely changed. Day or night, summer or winter, the ground remained steady, hovering around 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. This was not folklore. It was physics. The soil and stone absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. Wind could not reach it. Frost could not penetrate deeply. The deeper you went, the quieter winter became. Indigenous communities had understood this for generations. Food caches were carved into hillsides. Storage chambers were buried beneath the frost line. But these ideas rarely crossed into mainstream settler construction. On the American frontier, progress favored speed, visibility, and dominance over landscape. Raise walls, clear land, conquer winter. Yet winter was undefeated. So when one man stood before a limestone hillside and saw not an obstacle but an opportunity, he was not rejecting frontier knowledge. He was questioning its limits. He was asking a different question than everyone else. Not how do I keep feeding the fire, but why am I starting from zero every night? That question, quiet, practical, and deeply uncomfortable, set him apart. Because if winter was strongest in the open air, then perhaps the safest place to live was not above the ground at all. And that realization would soon collide with the beliefs of everyone watching him dig. The man at the hillside did not argue with anyone. He did not gather a crowd. He did not defend his choices. He did not try to convince his neighbors that he was right. He simply worked. At 42 years old, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned survival the slow way, through repetition, failure, and observation. His hands were scarred, his movements deliberate. Every strike of the pickaxe followed the grain of the rock, not his impatience. This was not the first time he had lived with stone. Long before the Rockies, his life had unfolded underground, beneath hills, inside quarries, along tunnel walls where winter and summer lost their meaning. In those places, men did not guess about temperature. They measured it. They felt it. They depended on it. Deep shafts taught a simple truth. The farther you descend, the less the world above matters. Storms raged overhead, but underground, the air stayed calm. Frost bit the surface, but stone below remained steady. Fire was used sparingly, not to fight the cold, but to supplement what the earth already provided. Those lessons stayed with him. So when he stepped off the railway into Montana territory and saw limestone rising from the valley floor, something clicked, not as inspiration but recognition. Others saw a cliff. He He saw a cross-section of shelter. He noticed how south-facing slopes caught winter sun, how snow melted there first, how wind slipped over exposed rock, but never into it. He noticed the density of limestone, the way it resisted quick temperature change. Where frontier builders looked for trees, he looked for layers. Where they counted days to raise walls, he counted feet into the hillside. This difference in thinking made him an outsider in more ways than one. On the American frontier, knowledge was inherited through tradition. How cabins were built, how fires were fed, how winters were endured. Newcomers were expected to adapt quickly, to follow what worked, not question it. But this man had learned under different conditions, in a different rhythm of life. His understanding of shelter was shaped by geology, not timber. By time, not speed. To him, digging into rock was not regression. It was refinement. He did not see stone as cold. He saw it as slow. Slow to warm. Slow to cool. Slow to fail. And slowness in winter was survival. While his neighbors raced to finish cabins before the first deep freeze, he invested his effort elsewhere. He measured angles. He chose his entry point carefully. He followed the natural bedding planes of limestone, allowing the rock to support itself rather than forcing it to comply. Every decision suggested patience, and patience on the frontier was often mistaken for weakness. People assumed he lacked urgency, that he did not understand what winter could do, that he was gambling his life on theory. But what they could not see was that he was not theorizing at all. He was remembering how miners slept underground in shirt sleeves while snow buried the hills above. Remembering how stone walls stayed warm long after fires burned low. Remembering that the earth, when left intact, resisted extremes. Most settlers believed survival meant building against nature. This man believed survival came from building within it. That belief isolated him. It marked him as different. It invited mockery. But it also gave him something few others possessed. A shelter strategy that did not depend on endless fuel, constant vigilance, or luck. As winter tightened its grip on the valley, that difference would no longer be philosophical. It would become physical, measured in warmth, measured in silence at night, measured in the simple fact of sleeping while others stayed awake to feed the fire. And soon, the hillside that everyone dismissed would begin to speak for itself. By early October, the decision was no longer theoretical. Winter stood at the edge of the valley, and the man at the limestone hillside committed fully to his plan. While other settlers hauled logs and stacked walls, he drove steel into stone. Every strike echoed across the slope. To his neighbors, this was proof of madness. They watched him work from a distance at first, arms crossed, shaking their heads. A cabin could be raised in weeks, they said. Walls meant shelter. Roofs meant survival. Digging into solid rock meant delay, and delay on the frontier killed. Stone is for foundations, they muttered. Not for living in. Cold sinks into rock. Everyone knows that. But he ignored the noise. He had chosen his site with care. The hillside faced south, angled to receive what little winter sun the Rockies allowed. Limestone layers ran thick and stable, their natural bedding planes offering strength without collapse. Water drainage followed predictable seams. This was not blind digging. It was informed excavation. He did not cut straight in. First, he carved downward. The entrance sloped gently into the hillside, descending several feet before turning upward again toward the main chamber. To onlookers, this made no sense. Why dig a trench only to climb back up inside? But this was the first quiet rejection of frontier convention. Cold air, heavier than warm, sinks. By lowering the entryway floor, he created a place for cold to settle, away from where he would live. Warm air, lighter, would remain above the threshold, trapped by the upward turn, an airlock carved from earth itself. Inside, he shaped the space slowly. He left natural pillars where the limestone demanded respect. He followed curves instead of forcing angles, forming an arched ceiling that distributed weight evenly and prevented heat from pooling uselessly near flat surfaces. Every wall, every surface remained stone. To the settlers watching, this confirmed their fears. Stone drew heat. Stone stole warmth from the body. Stone belonged outdoors. They expected to see him fail quickly. What they didn't understand was that he wasn't trying to warm the air. He was trying to warm the mass. Instead of building a wide fireplace that lost heat up the chimney, he carved a compact firebox directly into the limestone wall. Small, controlled, efficient. Above it, he He chiseled a narrow flue that snaked through the rock before reaching the surface. Every inch of that path transferred heat into the stone. The fire would not be the heater. It would be the charger. As the days shortened, criticism sharpened. Neighbors stopped offering advice and began offering bets. How long before he abandoned the hole? How long before the cold drove him out? Some predicted he wouldn't last until the first real freeze. They measured winter by the calendar. He measured it by preparation. 10 hours a day, 6 days a week he worked. Not rushed. Not frantic. Each block removed strengthened the structure that remained. Each decision reduced risk, rather than inviting it. When others hurried to finish cabins before snow buried their foundations, he focused on sealing, shaping, and balance. He knew that once underground, storms would matter less. By late October, the hillside held a completed chamber, modest in size but deliberate in design. Smooth stone walls, a curved ceiling, a deep entrance tunnel, ventilation shafts placed high and low to move fresh air without stripping heat. To his critics, it looked like a refrigerator. To him, it looked like a battery. And winter was about to test whose understanding of shelter was correct. Because soon, the temperature would drop not just below freezing, but far below reason. And when that happened, there would be no room for opinion. Only results. What the settlers feared most about stone was exactly what made it powerful. Stone does not warm quickly. And it does not cool quickly either. That slowness, so frustrating to the touch, was the entire point. In a log cabin, heat behaves like a restless animal. You feed the fire, and the room warms rapidly. Stop feeding it, and the warmth escapes just as fast. Heat rises, slips through cracks, disappears into the night. The fire must be watched, tended, obeyed. Stone plays a different game. Instead of chasing heat, it holds it. This is the principle of thermal mass, a concept modern engineers would later formalize, but one that miners and stoneworkers had understood intuitively for centuries. Thermal mass is not about how hot something gets. It's about how much energy it can absorb and how slowly it gives that energy back. A wooden wall weighs very little. It stores almost no heat. Once the fire dies, the temperature falls with it. But a limestone hillside weighs hundreds of thousands of pounds. Once warmed, it becomes a reservoir. The man in the hillside was not trying to heat air. Air holds heat poorly. It escapes, stratifies, and cools. He was heating the stone itself, charging it gradually, evenly, and deeply. This was why the firebox was small. A roaring fire wastes energy. Most of its heat vanishes up the chimney. But a controlled fire, fed slowly, transfers its warmth into whatever surrounds it. And in this case, what surrounded it was solid rock. The narrow flue carved through the limestone was not a mistake or an afterthought. It was intentional. Every bend, every extra foot of length forced hot gases to give up their energy to the stone before escaping. Instead of heating the sky, the fire heated the hillside. But thermal mass alone was only half the equation. The other half was the earth itself. Just a few dozen feet underground. The temperature does something remarkable. It stops changing. Day and night mean nothing. Winter and summer blur together. The ground settles into a steady range, usually around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. This is called geothermal stability. The earth, insulated by its own mass, resists extremes. So while cabins started each night fighting from below zero toward comfort, the stone shelter began already halfway there. The fire didn't need to create warmth from nothing. It only needed to raise the temperature slightly above what the earth naturally provided. This difference was enormous. Instead of battling a 70-degree gap between outside air and comfort, the shelter faced a gap of 15 or 20 degrees. That reduced fuel needs dramatically. And once the limestone absorbed that extra warmth, it released it slowly, hour after hour, long after the fire burned down to coals. This was why the walls felt warm to the touch. Not hot, not burning, just steady. The stone had become a silent heater, radiating warmth evenly across the chamber. No hot spots, no cold corners, no sudden drops in temperature at night. Even the ceiling mattered. By carving it into a gentle arch, he prevented warm air from collecting uselessly overhead. Instead, heat circulated naturally, guided by the shape of the space rather than forced by drafts. Ventilation was handled just as carefully. Fresh air entered low, where it could warm before rising. Stale air exited high, without pulling heat with it. The system breathed without bleeding warmth. Nothing here was accidental. Every choice reflected an understanding that winter was not an enemy to overpower, but a condition to design around. The settlers thought he was building a cold stone cave. In reality, he was building a thermal system, one that relied less on constant effort and more on patience. A system where fire worked once and stone worked all night. And as winter deepened, this quiet science, hidden beneath the hillside, was about to prove itself in ways no argument ever could. Winter did not test the valley gently. It arrived in waves, each colder than the last, until the thermometer no longer felt like a warning, but a verdict. By mid-January, the temperature dropped past zero and kept falling. -10, -15, then deeper still. Nights stretched long and merciless, the kind that punished even small mistakes. Cabins across the valley came alive after dark. Fireboxes glowed. Chimneys smoked without rest. Axes struck with late into the night as families fought to stay ahead of the cold. Sleep came in fragments. Wake, feed the fire, check the children, repeat. In many homes, the fire never went out. And still the cold crept in. Bedrooms far from the hearth dipped into the 30s. Water froze beside beds. Breath hung in the air until morning. Parents learned to judge the night not by time, but by how often they had to rise and tend the stove. This was frontier winter, as everyone understood it. And then there was the hillside. While cabins burned through wood by the armload, smoke rose quietly from a single vent near the cliff top. Not thick, not frantic, just steady. Inside the stone shelter, the air was calm. The fire had been lit earlier in the evening. Small, controlled, deliberate. No roaring flames. No constant tending. After a short burn, it was allowed to fade into coals. And then something strange happened. Nothing changed. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Outside, the cold deepened. Inside, the temperature held. The walls continued to radiate warmth, slow and patient, as if they had no interest in the chaos above ground. When morning came, the firebox was dark. The room was not. The stone had carried the night. While cabins fought temperature swings of 15 or 20 degrees between dusk and dawn, the shelter varied by only a few. There were no sharp drops. No cold corners waiting to surprise bare feet. The warmth felt even, almost gentle. Not the dry blast of a fire-fed room, but the steady comfort of stored heat. This was the difference thermal mass made when winter pushed back. Outside, the hillside lay buried under snow. Wind scoured the valley floor. The land looked lifeless. But inside the rock, winter had been slowed to a crawl. Fuel told the story even more clearly. Where cabins devoured wood continuously, the shelter consumed remarkably little. Each small burn added energy to the stone, and the stone returned it gradually, without noise, without effort. The result was not just warmth, but consistency. No frantic nights. No frozen mornings. No race to split more wood before dawn. Winter could rage all it wanted. The shelter did not argue. It simply waited, and in waiting it won. This was the moment when doubt began to crack, not in the limestone, but in the beliefs of the valley. Because what was happening inside that hillside could no longer be dismissed as luck or novelty. It was repeatable, it was measurable, and it was happening while everyone else was still feeding the fire. The cold had delivered its verdict, and it did not favor the cabins. At first, no one said anything. They stood just inside the entrance, boots still crusted with snow, shoulders hunched from the cold they had carried in with them. The transition was subtle, almost confusing. The kind of warmth you didn't immediately trust. It didn't hit like fire. It settled. One by one, coats were unbuttoned. Gloves came off. Breaths slowed. Conversations faded into silence as hands reached out, almost without thinking, to touch the stone walls. They were warm. Not warm like iron near a stove. Warm like something alive. This was the moment doubt began to fail. The men who had laughed the loudest said the least. They walked the chamber slowly, testing corners, crouching near the floor, standing beneath the arched ceiling. They were builders, after all. Their eyes searched for tricks. Hidden fires. Thick insulation. Something familiar to explain what they were feeling. There was nothing. Just stone. A thermometer hanging from the wall confirmed what their bodies already knew. While the valley outside shivered far below freezing, the air inside the shelter remained steady, comfortable, even. No roaring fire. No frantic tending. Just stored warmth, released on its own time. This unsettled them. Frontier knowledge was built on effort, on visible labor. on constant vigilance. You stayed warm because you worked for it, because you cut wood, fed fires, stayed awake. But here, warmth seemed to arrive without struggle. It challenged more than construction methods. It challenged pride. Some tried to explain it away. Maybe the cold hadn't been as bad that night. Maybe the hillside was unusually sheltered. Maybe it was just temporary luck. But winter did not cooperate with denial. The cold returned again and again, and each time, the stone shelter remained unchanged. Calm, warm, reliable. Gradually, the visits became quieter. People came not to argue, but to observe, to feel, to measure. Some brought their own thermometers. Others counted firewood. A few simply sat down, closed their eyes, and rested in a way winter had not allowed them to do in months. There was a subtle shift in language. They stopped calling it a cave. They started calling it shelter. Even the local elders, who had initially watched with caution, recognized something familiar in the design. They spoke of storage chambers carved into hillsides long before cabins ever stood in the valley. Places where food stayed cool in summer and unfrozen in winter. Knowledge that had never been written down, only practiced. Standing inside the limestone chamber, it became clear that no one had truly invented anything here. Different people had known different pieces of the same truth. The rock did not belong to one culture. The earth did not favor one tradition. It simply responded to those who listened. What began as ridicule transformed into curiosity. Curiosity into respect. And respect slowly into imitation. Questions replaced laughter. How deep did you go? Which direction does it face? How long does the heat last after the fire dies? These were no longer challenges. They were invitations. And in that quiet chamber, warmed by stone, steadied by earth, the frontier learned something it had nearly forgotten. Strength does not always come from forcing the land to obey. Sometimes, it comes from stepping inside it and letting it teach you how to endure. The winter passed. Snow retreated from the valley floor. Ice loosened its grip on the riverbanks. Cabins emerged from the thaw scarred, smoke-stained, and short on firewood. But the hillside did not change. The stone shelter stood exactly as it had through the coldest nights, quiet, intact, unbothered by the season that had exhausted everyone else. And that permanence left an impression far deeper than any argument ever could. Because what had happened there was bigger than one man, bigger than one winter, bigger even than the frontier itself. Without naming it, the settlers had witnessed something modern engineers would not formally articulate for nearly a century: earth-sheltered design. They had seen geothermal stability in action. They had felt thermal mass doing its slow, patient work. They had lived inside a system that did not demand constant input, only understanding. In later decades, these same principles would reappear under new names: masonry heaters, passive solar design, ground-coupled buildings. During the energy crises of the 20th century, architects and engineers would celebrate them as innovations. But they were not new. They were remembered. What made the stone shelter remarkable was not its complexity, but its restraint. Nothing extra was added. Nothing unnecessary was burned. The solution came not from machinery, but from alignment, with gravity, with heat flow, with geology. Efficiency, it turned out, was not about more power. It was about less waste. Frontier cabins fought winter by brute force. They burned and burned again, accepting loss as inevitable. The hillside shelter simply refused to lose heat in the first place. That difference matters. It changes how people live, how they sleep, how they plan their days, how much fear they carry through the long nights. And it carries a lesson that extends far beyond cold climates. Modern life often celebrates speed. Quick builds, fast fixes, immediate results. We add systems to compensate for what we ignore: bigger heaters, thicker insulation, louder machines. But the earth does not move quickly, and it does not reward impatience. The stone shelter succeeded because it respected time. It allowed heat to move slowly. It trusted mass over motion. It understood that stability is more powerful than force. This is why similar structures appear again and again across cultures and centuries: carved dwellings in volcanic rock, hillside homes buried beneath sod, storage chambers tucked into cliffs, separated by geography, united by observation. The frontier had nearly forgotten this wisdom, distracted by the tools of a new industrial age. But winter had a way of stripping assumptions bare. When fuel ran low, when exhaustion set in, when the fire demanded attention every hour, suddenly, the quiet warmth of stone felt less like a curiosity and more like an answer. Not a rejection of progress. A correction. The hillside shelter did not replace cabins everywhere. It didn't need to. Its role was subtler than that. It reminded people that survival was not always about building bigger, faster, louder. Sometimes, it was about building deeper. About recognizing that the land beneath us is not neutral. It is active, generous, and patient if we are willing to work with it rather than over it. The winter had revealed a truth that would linger long after the snow melted. The earth had always known how to keep people warm. All it ever asked in return was that someone slow down long enough to notice. And that realization would shape everything that followed. Long after that winter loosened its grip, the hillside remained. Snow came and went. Wind carved new paths across the valley. Cabins were repaired, rebuilt, or abandoned altogether. But the stone shelter endured. It did not sag. It did not rot. It did not ask for constant attention. On cold mornings, a faint breath of warmth still drifted from its entrance, barely visible against the frozen air. Inside, the walls held yesterday's heat with the same patience they had shown decades before. Nothing about it was loud. Nothing about it demanded recognition. And yet, it carried a lesson far larger than its size. The man who carved it never claimed invention. He never spoke of brilliance. He never framed his work as a breakthrough. When asked how it worked, he gestured simply to the stone around him. The earth already knows, he would say. We only forget how to listen. That may be the most uncomfortable truth of all, because it suggests that progress does not always move forward. Sometimes, it circles back, retracing paths abandoned not because they failed, but because they were misunderstood. The frontier believed survival meant conquering the land, cutting it, clearing it, raising walls against it. But winter taught a different lesson. The land was not the enemy. Ignorance was. Stone did not steal warmth. It guarded it. The earth did not resist life. It stabilized it. What failed was not the climate, but the assumptions carried into it. And those assumptions are not unique to the past. Even today, we chase solutions that add complexity instead of removing waste. We build louder systems to overcome problems that quiet design could have prevented. We burn more, consume more, and wonder why efficiency keeps slipping through our fingers. The hillside offers a quieter answer. It reminds us that wisdom is often already present, embedded in geology, climate, and time-tested observation. That the most powerful technologies may not hum or glow, but sit silently beneath our feet. The stone shelter was never about hiding from winter. It was about understanding it. It proved that a single person, armed not with machines but with attention, could outthink an entire season. That humility could outperform force. That listening could succeed where noise failed. And that survival, at its core, is not about domination. It is about alignment. So the next time the cold presses in, or the world feels louder than it needs to be, remember the hillside. Remember that beneath the chaos, the earth remains steady. That heat can be stored. That patience compounds. That some answers do not need to be invented, only recognized. The stone is still there. Quiet, warm, waiting. And it continues to teach the same lesson it always has. The earth has never stopped knowing how to keep us alive. We just have to remember how to learn from it.